Welcome everybody to the 20th annual Brattleboro Literary Festival. This makes me feel incredibly old since I've been part of the festival since the inception. And I was an author. I'm Suzanne Kingsbury, and I'm so excited to be at this particular session presenting to internationally acclaimed authors, Ralph Eubanks and Steve Yarbrough. And I was just saying, it's so nice to have a little bit of the South and the North, even though these two gentlemen are actually living in the North right now, in the sort of what I think of as one of the bastions of the literary world in the North, which is Boston. And just remember, you guys can submit any questions that you have. There's a Q&A button on your screen. I think it's always on the bottom right there. And you can just, there'll be links in the chat to purchase their books and that sort of thing. But there's also a way that you can ask questions, and I'll try to monitor that for you. So feel free to ask them any questions. So I wanna introduce first Ralph Eubanks. William Faulkner once said, to understand the world, you must first understand a place like Mississippi. And in his new book, A Place Like Mississippi, Ralph Eubanks moves through the pictorial and literary landscape of one of the most misunderstood and complicated and beautiful terrains of our country. Hailed as a stunning must-read by Time Magazine, NPR, Vanity Fair, and the photographer Sally Mann, among many more, A Place Like Mississippi is the literary journal of a lifetime. Mr. Eubanks is also the author of two other highly acclaimed books, both memoirs, and has contributed articles to the Washington Post, Wired, the Hedgehog Review, the Wall Street Journal, the American Scholar, the New Yorker, and National Public Radio. He's the recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship and is currently the Carl and Lily, and Ralph, you're going to have to help me here.
Horsheimer.
Horsheimer. Okay. I was like, I'm going to completely flub this name. Foundation Fellow at the Harvard Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study. We're so happy you're here, Ralph Eubanks. Thank you.
Thank you.
He's in conversation today with Steve Yarbrough, who straddles both sides of the Mason-Dixon too, born and educated in the South, and the author of a shelf of novels set in the South, which are some of my favorite. And Steve lives and teaches in Massachusetts. He's at Emerson College. He's won the Mississippi Institute of Arts and Letters Award in Fiction, the Mississippi Authors Award, the California Book Award, and the Mississippi Institute of Arts and Letters Award in Fiction. He was also the finalist for the PEN/Faulkner Award. And what I'm most excited about, and I know you guys will be too, is that his next book, Stay Gone Days, love the title, will be published next April. So if you could just give a warm welcome right now to both Ralph and Steve, and you guys, let's begin the conversation.
Great. Thank you, Suzanne.
Yes, thank you.
So, Ralph, when you sent me the page proofs for the new book, of course, I was really very excited. I was surprised when I began to read it, and I have to say why. Just as I'm always telling fiction writing students that, when you have a character walk through a door into somebody's apartment and you start recording what he notices, you can arrange those details differently. And if you do, you're going to create a completely different impression. If he sees the poker by the fireplace first, that's one thing. If he sees it last, that's another. And I would have assumed that probably Ralph is going to start this book in one of two places. He's either going to start by writing about Oxford and the literary community there, or he's going to jump over and write about the Delta first. And lo and behold, when I opened the book, you started on the Mississippi Gulf Coast. And I was very surprised. it put a completely different spin on things. And I'm just curious how you hit on that idea.
I thought about that idea because I was trying to turn the way we think about Mississippi's literary origins on its head a little bit. We, when my editor proposed this book to me, he thought that I would start in the Delta. And I felt that I didn't want to start there. I didn't quite know where I wanted to start, but I knew I didn't want to start there. And I realized that there were two very important writers in Mississippi right now, Natasha Tretheway and Jessamyn Ward. So I decided to start on the Gulf Coast instead. And Natasha Tretheway's Theories of Time and Space is the epigraph for the book for that reason, because what I did in thinking about that was I went to that spot that she talks about where Highway 49 runs dead end into the Gulf Coast, and just stood there, looked out, and realized that what she'd written about is really there's a place that we think of that feels like the end of Mississippi, but it's really the beginning. And that's why I chose to start there. I think Jessamyn has a very long career ahead of her, as does Natasha. And I think rather than starting where we like to think everything began, let's start where things for contemporary Mississippi writing, where that's began.
Right. Well, I thought it was a stunning choice, and it took me into the book in a completely different way. And it made this a radically and wonderfully different reading experience from what I might have expected. I think that, among other things, the book functions at times almost like a novel. It is a story that you're telling. And because of that, I certainly don't want to give away the ending, but if you wanted to say something about where you end, I think that would be really interesting.
Right. Well, I will say, okay, it begins on the Gulf Coast. We move into my native Piney Woods, place that literary critic Noel Polk, who did all the definitive versions of Faulkner, said is this place beyond the Southern myth, and it's also where I am from. Moving over into Natchez and Vicksburg, which are these places that are very much part of the Southern myth, into Jackson, which we think of as the land of Eudora Welty, but it's much more than that. And then to Western Mississippi, going up through Meridian with Brad Watson's work, up through Philadelphia, into Oxford, over into the Delta last. And then the final chapter, the epilogue, takes place at Parchman Farm Penitentiary in the Delta.
Why did you choose to end in Parchman?
I had for many years been reading the work of the Prison Rights Project that's run by Louis Bourgeois out of Oxford. I had written a blurb for one of his volumes of prison writing. And there's something that one of the writers said in one of those anthologies about poverty coming with an entourage. And I thought about that entourage and the people that have been kind of poverty has led them into, poverty and other circumstances have led them into Parchman. And I approached Louis about actually going into Parchman to work with the students there, the writing, and also to talk about the poet Etheridge Knight, who is from Mississippi, who spent time in prison, and who I believe, if he had committed the same crime he committed in Indiana, he would never have found himself as a writer. He would have been working out in the fields in Parchman. And that was very life-changing for me, because rather than Parchman being this place that I drove past, I got to know people inside of that prison, and I began to see that place as a place that is also another place that brings part of Mississippi's writing. It's part of my fellow Mississippi authors are inside of Parchman.
Right. Not to mention many of the finest musicians in the state. You know, at any given time might be in the Parchman Prison Band.
Right. And, you know, part of the, I see as the literature of the Delta, and I talk about the blues, and a lot of that comes out of Parchman. And that the blues almost functions like this. A lot of the songs are like epic poems. And I wanted to connect that place of Parchman with the literature. And I think it was much better kind of getting there at the end rather than beginning there.
Right. Well, one of the other things that surprised me when I saw the galleys, you know, I was just paging through on my iPad, and then here came these stunning photographs. The book is visually arresting. The photographs in this book, I think, make me see Mississippi like I've never seen it before. And I wanted to ask you, you know, how much did you have to do with the photographs? Did you participate in choosing them, or was that the editor?
I participated in choosing them. My former photo editor at the Library of Congress, Amy Paston, helped me begin to think about this, as Amy always did with all the books I did at the Library of Congress. And then I think originally the book was to have 150 photographs. In the end, it had 100. We pulled about 300 photographs to consider, and then started to whittle it down, thinking about how the story flowed. I was very careful to try to choose photographs that I felt were, you know, really didn't kind of travel in Southern essentialism. That there's, you know, it's much more than the rusty red pickup out in the field, you know, surrounded by a cypress swamp, you know. But I wanted to capture the beauty of the place, as well as for readers to kind of see what I saw, because I traveled all over the state, and I was always trying to find something that looked like something I had seen. And that's what really drove it. And also getting to choose photographers whom I know, like Maudie and Langdon Clay, Rory Doyle, Tabitha Soren, and a few photographers I didn't know. And, you know, also getting to work with David Ray Morris. David Ray Morris did the photo shoot with Jessamyn Ward when I interviewed her. And then using some of David Ray's photographs of William Morris. And I think a couple of his landscape shots of the Delta as well. I mean, my editor did kind of switch one photograph out. You love this story. She switched it. The photo editor at Timber switched a photo out because we hadn't gotten permission. And she put it in. I looked at it, I said, and it was a stock image. And I said, that's not the Delta. And I checked the metadata, and it was a cotton field in Israel. And I said, no. So it's like I got on the phone to Maudie Clay. I said, Maudie, I need a picture.
Well, that resonates with me, because when I saw the cover of my second book, which is a collection of stories called Mississippi History, all of which was set in the Delta, the image doesn't look like anything in the Delta at all. And I didn't feel like I could do much arguing at that point. But later on, I did say, you know, that doesn't really look like the Delta. Where did it come from? And the answer was that it was a photograph that had been taken somewhere near St. Louis.
And it was as long as it was along the Mississippi River, we thought that was okay.
Sure, right. Well, you know, one of the photos that's just kind of mind-boggling is that photo of all the writers in Oxford. Could you say something about that? I mean, it's like an entire football team full of writers.
Right, and that's not even the entire team. So I mean, it's amazing what you can do with a doodle poll. So Richard Howarth and Lynn Roberts developed this entire spreadsheet of every writer that they knew working in Oxford. And that included, academic writers who may have crossed over or whose academic work was so well known that they considered them, Oxford writers. And I believe there were over 40 on the list.
Yeah.
And what we did was, after I sent out a date, said, these are the dates we've got. Langdon Clay shot the photograph. And they all cluster around one date. So there are a few people that are missing there, like John T. Edge and Wright Thompson, Lee Durkee, few people who just couldn't quite make it, that Jack Pendarvis. But that was a whole group of them right there. And I always say that it's really interesting. This is not too long after Kiese Laymon's Heavy had come out. So Kiese is kind of peering over in the back of that photograph. And I think not quite sure where he fit in this firmament at that moment. I think that he would be probably front and center now, would feel a little more secure in that where he fit. But it was really a wonderful day. And the inspiration for that is the Great Day in Harlem photograph of all the jazz singers. I knew that photograph, and I was trying to capture the spirit of that photograph by capturing this moment in Oxford, Mississippi. This would have been in 2019. Yeah, 2019.
Right. When you and I were undergrads in Oxford, there was the Faulkner House, and there was the conference, and that was always a moving experience, because you saw people coming from all over the world to Oxford because of books that they had lived in their own minds. But it was a far cry from the Oxford of today. And I think the moment that I became aware of how things had changed, when I was, writer in residence there for 1 year, I went out one morning to pick up the Memphis paper, and I had my bathrobe on. And this, of course, is across the street from Faulkner's house. And here goes a tour bus driving slowly by, and I hear somebody say over the speaker, and this is the current writer in residence, Steve Yarbrough. And I immediately looked down to make sure that my bathrobe was properly closed. It's a literary hotbed now.
It really is. And I often tell people that I don't do anything in Oxford, Mississippi that I don't want the whole world to know. So it is. And there are lots of writers living there, working there. Some who come there for the MFA end up staying, like William Boyle. And so, William teaches, I think, maybe one class there, but he's a full-time writer, and writes these amazing, I don't know if you call them literary thrillers, but they're all set in Brooklyn. But he's working in Oxford, Mississippi, and feels very much as an Oxford writer, that he's an Oxford writer. It's just that the place that is part of his literary imagination is far away from there.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really big change. People like Amy Nizuku Matata, who's writing there, who's not from the South, but has really adopted the South. She says, I'm a Southerner now. Beth Ann Finley is the same way. So we have people who have, that was kind of unheard of when we were undergraduates. You were a Southerner, you were a Northerner, you didn't claim that you had switched your allegiances. And these are people who say, no, this is where I am. This is what I write about. So I am a Southern writer now. I think that's, by opening that up, it's really given a great deal of texture to the way that people write about Mississippi and its landscape.
Right. One of the things that was so, if I can do a little personal history here, we've known each other for 45 years. We met at the University of Mississippi in Oxford. And Ralph, if I had predicted a future for you, it would have included all the excellence that your books have manifest. But I would not have expected you to be writing about Mississippi because you were so much more worldly than the rest of us. You were reading Henry James. You weren't really focused on Southern literature per se when I knew you. And I'm just curious, what has made you go back now and write about where we come from and write about it so beautifully, but in a different way now?
I think it was the years of exile brought about this longing for home. You find yourself in your mid 40s. I tell people that I ended up coming back to Mississippi in November 11th, 1999, to begin work in the Sovereignty Commission files, thinking I would write this book about this kind of cultural history of the Sovereignty Commission that did not include me, that I wasn't part of that story. And it was when I came back that I realized I was part of the story. And spending time in that archive sent me back to the place I was from. And I found myself, this middle-aged man sitting on the ground where I grew up, crying like a baby, because this was who I am. And I'd erased Mississippi from my tongue. I had done everything I could. And then I'm back there and it's who I am. And I guess maybe what I tell people is that sense of exile when you're an expatriate is always with you. And when you come back, you look at the place very differently.
Right.
And I guess maybe what I did from my years away was using that as a different lens to look at the place rather than being so close to it. I have to tell you, my great fear of going to Radcliffe for the fellowship this year to write a book about the Mississippi Delta, to begin this work on this book, was I was going to be too far away from the Delta. In Oxford, I'm an hour away. But what I've been finding is that distance has been very helpful for me to prepare for what it is that I look at when I go back to Oxford. I've been spending time looking at the journals of June Jordan when she went to the Delta in 1970, and basically took the same journey through it that I'm trying to write about, from Holmes County to Tunica.
Right.
What did she see 50 years ago? How did it look differently? And that's, just kind of happening upon that on Thursday of last week. It's like, now I know what I have to do when I go back. And so it's a great gift, actually, that distance. And my time as a failed Victorianist.
Well, I really do understand what you're saying about the distance, because when I was growing up, I didn't read very many Southern writers. I read writers like Graham Greene. I read, once I was in my late teens and early 20s. And I didn't really think that much about where I was from. It was just my day-to-day reality. I tended to want to escape it. When I moved to California, where I lived for 21 years, there was not a day of my life that somebody hearing me say 2 or 3 sentences failed to ask, where are you from? And when you're being asked all day long, off and on all day long, where are you from? You begin to ask yourself where you're from. What's different about where I'm from? And I think that, that distance for me as well created a really different perspective on where I was from. I want to put in a plug, by the way, for the book that you just mentioned, Ever Is a Long Time, which I think is just one of the finest memoirs I've ever read. And rest assured, you are not the only person who cried as a result of that, because when I read it, I cried too. And it's a spectacular memoir. And I would urge everyone to grab themselves a copy.
Well, you're very kind, Steve. And I would urge people to read your work too, because you gave me a perspective on the Delta. When I was writing that chapter about the Delta, I was returning to your work and realizing that what you were trying to do with your work was to kind of give this post-civil rights era, particularly in the Oxygen Man, view of what life in the Delta was like, rather than kind of, let's kind of remain in this Delta past. You took us into this Delta present, and even going back to the 70s in the Oxygen Man, by kind of bringing in, the boy at the academy. I mean, it's for me, it was, this is so real Mississippi to me. And one thing I'm curious about is you made the switch from Indianola and the Oxygen Man, then it becomes Loring. Why'd you switch your place names? And also I noticed the map of Loring expands over time.
I guess I got tired of people, every time I went to visit my parents, somebody would say, I know everybody in all of your books. And, I thought, okay, I'm not going to write the word Indianola on the page anymore. I'll just make up my own town. And Loring, because that little, where the cannon stands over on the near Fort Pemberton.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Well, the commanding officer there for a while was a gentleman named Loring. And so I decided to appropriate his name for the town, which absolutely did not stop anything. People continued to say, I know everybody in that book.
Well, I always wondered about that. And it's something that kind of, and I saw this connection between your work and Elizabeth Spencer's.
Yeah. Yeah. I love Elizabeth Spencer's work beyond measure. And I got to be her friend about the last 10 or 12 years of her life, by which time I was already in my 50s. And apparently she always referred to me as that sweet boy from over in Indianola. She really deserves to be read by everybody, and in a sense, she spoke to me too, because she left the Delta like I did. She wrote beautifully about Italy. She lived in Canada for a long time. You carry it with you wherever you go. I have to ask you, could I get you to say a little bit more about what you're working on now?
Certainly. I am working on a book on the Mississippi Delta, and I have two questions up on a whiteboard in my office at Harvard. One says, what are the cultural, policy and political issues that have negatively affected the lives of the people of the Delta? So I'm looking at those issues. And then also, how has the mythology of the Delta prevented us from seeing the realities of the place? Thinking about that whole idea that in the law of willful blindness, the way that if you willfully ignore something, according to the law, that can be cause for someone to accuse you of negligence. And I feel that that idea of willful blindness can be applied to the Delta. And I'm really exploring that question that turns up at the end of The Most Southern Place on Earth, has the Delta, are we allowing the country to become the Delta writ large, rather than the South just being the South writ large? But there are a lot of Deltas in this country. So not only am I looking at the income inequality in the Delta, but how does income inequality in the Delta, how are there many other Deltas around the country? And what is it that we can learn by looking at the history of the Delta?
Right. I can occasionally be quite bitter about the Delta, as I think you know. And
Yes.
I, over the last 4 or 5 years, have begun to feel a lot more alienated from it than I had ever been before, to the point that I began to ask myself sometimes, will I ever see my hometown again? Do I want to see my hometown again? And it feels to me, Ralph, and this is really from the heart, that in a place like Mississippi, and in a lot of your work, you seem to be able to bring a greater degree of generosity to the page than I think I'm feeling right now. And where does that come from?
I think that it's that as a Mississippian, I feel we have a lot to explain.
Mhm.
And I do wonder sometimes if we engage in a lot of willful blindness and don't explain it. And I think the reason I tell people that I want my writing to be this, to bring some clarity to how we look at both Mississippi and the South, and also to see these Southern places as American places.
Right.
Well, trying to move beyond this idea of exceptionalism. And some of that generosity on the page may come from my desire to explain for the readers, and also for me to try to understand myself. You know, a lot of times, you know, we say that writers should write about what they know. I know Mississippi really well, but I'm also interested in what I don't know about the place. I mean, there's so many things I don't know about the Delta, and I'm trying to explore those questions. And I think anytime I'm engaged with a writing project, I'm looking at those questions that I don't know. I want to find the answers to them if they can be found, or explore them in some ways. And maybe that's where that generosity comes from, is that need to explain.
Well, I have to ask you, you know, given the political realities in the state right now, would you say that you can find cause for optimism in terms of where Mississippi is, or maybe in 5 or 10 years?
I can't say that I find reasons for optimism. And I think that's why I write about Mississippi, is I hope that there's someone who picks up one of my books and says that, you know, and may read some of my writing and may say they disagree with me. And I know there are a lot of people who do. And maybe find a kernel of something that might change the way they begin to think about the place. And I've gotten a little bit of correspondence about that. So it gives me a kind of glimmer of hope. But where I really do feel that hope come through is in the students I teach at the University of Mississippi. And if we can just find a way to keep some of those people in Mississippi, it could become a very different place. But we are pushing them away. Mississippi is the only Southern state that lost population in the last census. We are sending our young people out into the world, but I think at some point they're going to want to come back. And I think when they do decide they're going to come back, it could become a very different place. That's where my optimism comes in. But where we are right now, I don't feel good about it at all.
Yeah.
And if I said that I was optimistic, I would really also be engaged in willful blindness.
Right. Well, I'm going to ask you one last question. I think we're supposed to leave a little bit of time for the people in the audience, but given how spectacular a storyteller you are, have you ever thought of venturing into my world and writing a novel?
Well, I'm going to tell you what people always ask me, say, why are you a nonfiction writer? And I say, I'm a nonfiction writer because I'm really bad at making shit up. And it's like, and I said, and also, I'm from Mississippi and I don't have to make up a damn thing. There's so many stories out there that if you just kind of tease them out, they come up to the surface. So no, I haven't had the temptation to become a fiction writer.
Yeah. Well, you know, I write nonfiction from time to time, and my wife is fond of saying there's more fiction in his nonfiction than there is in his fiction.
Yeah, I mean, I know my wife thinks I should probably, venture into fiction, but I say I don't have to. I'm from Mississippi. There's just so much there to write about, and quite seriously, I am bad at making stuff up.
Right. Well, Suzanne, should we keep talking, or do we need to turn it over to the questions from the audience yet?
This is fascinating. I love hearing you guys talk. There are no questions yet, although people are welcome to start asking them. I'm very interested. It's interesting, Steve, that you asked that question about sort of now and how you're viewing Mississippi now. And I'm just curious, like, there's always this question around responsibility, in the literary arts, and I guess what responsibility authors have, or do they have some sort of influence on the trajectory of how things go? Like, do you think there's a way to influence that trajectory right now in the literary arts, or what do you see as sort of the role of the literary arts and maybe having some kind of impact there?
I think as a nonfiction writer, I do think that there is a way to have some impact. And I have to say that I've been completely surprised by the reception to this book. And what I have found that a lot of people have said to me is that it has made them begin to think about Mississippi in a different way. And the people from Mississippi, some who may have been a little bit skeptical of me even writing a book like this, would say, oh, it's made me think about some of the things we may need to be taking a closer look at, as in Mississippi who've been who've never left and haven't really looked critically about where we are. And I know there are people who feel that I put too much of a layer of race over this narrative, but I don't think you can't even talk about Mississippi without talking about that. It is part of the fabric of Mississippi, just like it's part of the fabric of this country. Yeah. It's just that we like to think that it's only Mississippi that has these issues. The issues of Mississippi are the issues of our country. The night that Donald Trump was elected, I posted on Twitter, "Good morning, America. Welcome to Mississippi."
Welcome to Mississippi.
and for 4 years we had Flem Snopes in the White House. So that's kind of where we had a taste of Mississippi. And
yeah.
Would you agree with that, Steve?
Oh, would I ever agree with that? Growing up in Mississippi in the early 60s, as a white kid, I had this sense of that we were a pariah. And I remember thinking, I bet people in Nebraska look down on us, or people in Massachusetts look down on us, or whatever. I live 6 miles north of Boston, and in an area where I go for a walk regularly. Not too long ago, around high school graduation time, I was walking by a house and I thought, the wind was blowing. Did I just get a glimpse of the Confederate flag? And the wind hit again. And I realized that what I was looking at on a graduation party about, half a mile from where I'm sitting right now, was a two-sided flag. It had the American flag on one side and had the Confederate flag on the other side. And that was flying at a graduation party. So the town that I live in, 40% of the people here voted for Donald Trump. So it's no longer a question of state to state, if it ever was. I mean, the John Birch Society was founded in Belmont, Massachusetts, about 6 miles from here. So I think it's it's gotten very complicated. Mississippi is always among us, even in Massachusetts.
Or even in Michigan, where I went to escape from Mississippi. I went to Ann Arbor as a graduate student. Michigan was the first place I saw a Confederate flag in the North, on the Lower Peninsula, just south of the Upper Peninsula.
Right.
So you look at the militias that have turned up in Michigan. I was just in northern Michigan last weekend, and it felt like I was in Mississippi sometimes.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting to think about the bias both ways, right? Because after living in Mississippi and coming back north, there was this, these stereotypes that kept getting thrown around about it, and it's complex, and that's why I think Ralph, the book is so important, really, is to show that complexity. And also Steve's novels, I mean, there's a way in which we decide that that's them, it's like, okay, well, that's going on down there, and we're sort of going to objectify it, rather than saying it's a very rich culture, it's got so much inside of it, and also being able to hold that sort of non-dual reality of the dark side, which really, I think a place like Mississippi, that's what it's giving us. And it is a metaphor, or a sort of a mirror almost, for the greater culture that we don't want to see, sort of. And I'm just curious, when you were doing the book, Ralph, like when you were integrating sort of the old literary South and the new, like you said, you started, Natasha and Jessamyn were very sort of up for you when you started down on the Gulf Coast. I mean, did that give you any hope, like in terms of sort of seeing who was emerging now and who kind of was always celebrated in the past?
That does give me hope about who is celebrated now and who is celebrated in the past. And just to be clear about that, I think there are people that were celebrated in the past that deserve to continue to be celebrated. I feel very strongly that every American should read Faulkner. I don't think you should be able to graduate from the University of Mississippi without reading Faulkner. That doesn't happen, mind you, but Faulkner explained so much about my home state to me in ways that no one else ever made clear to me. Or the way that I think about Eudora Welty's photographs, what they say to me about the landscape itself, and then also how she may have shaped some of her characters. Suzanne Mars and I have talked about this. She says, no, Eudora didn't use those photographs to create her characters. But I said, I always see them in those photographs. So somehow it's imprinted on her memory. She had that type of memory. So I do think that enlarges the way that we think of the place. We think of the people who are the writers, the interpreters of that place. And that gives me hope. If we could really get those interpreters of the place, that message that they're trying to get out, particularly the message that I think both Jessamyn and Natasha write about, that could be transformative. I really do believe that it's literature, intense study of literature in Mississippi, our own literature, could really be transformative of the place itself.
Yeah, it's such a great point. And one of the attendees was asking whether you were surprised at that sort of geographic distribution of writers. Like, we tend to think that all of the writers in Mississippi live in Oxford, and the rest of the people, are like illiterate, is what the attendee said. So I don't know. But yeah, I mean, was that a surprise, or did you kind of, both of you, sort of know about that geographic distribution because you're from there?
I knew about that geographic distribution, didn't you, Steve? I mean, I think we've said you didn't know the Piney Woods very well, which is where I'm from.
Yeah, I don't know that region well. I was aware of the geographical distribution, but I don't think I've ever seen it just laid out so clearly and persuasively as it is in this particular book. And I have to say that even coming from the state, you made me see some things that I had overlooked before. And one of them, yes, is the region that you come from. Is my grandmother's from there, but I know nothing about the Piney Woods.
Yeah, I mean, the Piney Woods is our kind of flyover territory. And as I tell people, there were so few photographs of the Piney Woods. A lot of the photographs in that section are photographs that I took. And I do not think of myself as a photographer. But I asked some of the best documentary photographers that I know, David Wharton and Tom Rankin, and none of them had photographs of the Piney Woods because no one felt it was a place worthy of that type of documentation. So I had to go out and kind of, what is it that I saw as a child? What does it look like now? I hope that I succeeded. I don't think that my work measures up to the great photographers who are part of this book, but I had to document that place in a way that someone would really, if they went there, they would know what they would find.
Mm-hmm.
And if anyone ever turns up, there's a picture of Powell's Drugstore in Mount Olive, Mississippi. If you're listening and you ever end up in Mount Olive, Mississippi, you just tell them that Ralph said that come in for a cold Coca-Cola. And they'll probably even give it to you for free. So
you also have some people just weighing in about, how rich your work is. This Fred Anklam says that just as Steve's Oxygen Man brought the perception of Mississippi into the modern era, so does Ralph's journey and his choice of how to write about his writers bring a new, more current understanding of the state. And thank you for your work. And Gail Rosenfeld says Steve's The Realm of Last Chances is a beautiful book and one of her favorites. She's listening in from Metro West Massachusetts and finds the conversation delightful and interesting. So thanks a lot, you guys.
yeah.
And I'm interested too, and I think a lot of the people who come to the literary festival are always interested in relationships between writers and sort of if you've influenced each other's work, how the relationship has grown. You said you were in the English Honor Society when you were in undergrad together. And, Steve was talking about sort of what he thought your career would look like, Ralph. And is it helpful to have each other sort of also right around the corner? And are you kind of stimulated by each other's work? And I'm sure you are, and in what ways? And if you could just talk about your friendship a little bit. I mean, how lovely that must be to have each other.
Well, it's nice to know someone who knew you when you were about 19 years old. And also, Steve says he saw me as very worldly. And I thought of myself as so worldly and sophisticated. And I saw myself as so country. And I realized that for much of my life, I've been trying to kind of not only kind of overcome being the country boy, but in some ways try to own that piece of myself too. So it's always been this conflict. And I think maybe, Steve, that's probably what you were seeing there, is that conflict of that small town country boy who really wanted to be the sophisticated, who did everything he could to try to shake that off in some way.
At least you knew what to shoot for, Ralph. I mean, until I was about 15, I thought that was a fanger. That's how I probably wouldn't even be able to understand the kid that I was if I heard him speak today. What I will say, I tell my graduate students that to know somebody else when they're young and to have a suspicion that they're going to do really big and important things, and I'm speaking here, as a writer, to sort of go through the world with somebody like that, so that you see when they have a new book out and you get excited about that. I mean, I remember back during the Mississippi flag controversy, opening my iPad one night, clicking on the New Yorker app, and here's this piece about Ralph. And I think as soon as I finished reading it, you correct me if I'm wrong, I believe I sent you a text, and
You did.
no one else could have written that. I mean, literally, I could not have written. No one else but Ralph Eubanks could have written that piece. And that's just been a wonderful thing. It really, really has. We had an evening here about 3 or 4 weeks ago where I won't say how many red wine bottles in the morning.
No, we don't want people to judge us, Steve.
But we had a lovely conversation, and it's just you can't put a price on something like these relationships.
And I think someone knowing you for that long, and I think Steve is probably getting to know me, thinking of me as a sophisticated, listening to Clear Channel Radio to change my accent.
Mhm.
You know, I would listen to WLW from Cincinnati. A lot of people place my accent in Ohio. That's why.
Well-
Because I would figure, you know, you said you thought this was a finger, and I thought the thing you wrote was an ink pen. And that it was that something that you stuck yourself with was a pin, and the thing that you wrote with was a pen.
Yeah.
And it was that, and kind of figuring out that difference. But I can lapse into my Piney Woods accent if I'm there. I can pull it up if I really need it. And there are times that I'm in Mississippi when I really need it. Just because I want people to know, you know, I'm from here. This is who I am. You know, this place marked me. And I think that knowing someone who knew you when you're trying to figure out who you want it to be is, you know, it's a great gift.
Most definitely. When I came for my interview at Emerson College in 2009, the president of the school at that time was her background was in speech pathology. And when she talked to me, after she talked to me for about 15 minutes, she said, I have to ask you something. You lived in California for 21 years and you still sound like you sound. Why is that? And I said, you know, I don't want to forget what my characters sound like. And she said, this is just impossible. You've got to be putting it on. And, you know, I said, well, I'm not. This is really me.
Yeah, and I think this is really me, but I mean, I'm a code switcher. And if I am back in Mississippi, I mean, you've been with me at Oxford. You kind of know how I could kind of lapse into it, because as when I was there a few years ago, my daughter was with me, and she turned and heard me. She said, stop talking like that. And my friend said, oh, honey, when he does that, he's really comfortable. Just leave him alone. So.
Yeah, I mean, that's fascinating. That's just, I mean, that's a conversation that I feel like could go on for a really long time, you know, in terms of that sort of what's happening with the impact of accent. And I mean, it's just fascinating to hear you guys talk about it. And it's also, I think, one more thing I wanted to ask, and this can be sort of a parting piece for the audience, is one thing about your friendship that's very clear is that you saw potential in one another when you were young, 19 years old, and then that potential got realized. And that's sort of rare, I think. I think in the creative world, it feels like there's a lot of chance for U-turn, or there's a way that we take sort of the safe path that isn't the sort of the literary or the creative. And I'm curious if you could sort of, like, what's one, to reduce it kind of to one thing that kept you on that path, that literary path, that love of the word and the word as having influence in your world and out in the world. If you could just say, like, you know, one thing that sort of kept you on track with it.
I think, well, because I worked in book publishing for many years. And I think I did really kind of sublimate that, my years as an editor, that desire to be a writer. Um, and it was, really, and as kind of my writing career kind of, I published my first piece in my 20s, I believe, but it was that I really didn't really go full into it until middle age. But I guess what really did it for me was helping others, seeing how I know how books are made. And I had that's what really kind of sustained me all those years, was knowing how books are made, and then finally realizing I want to do that, but I want to do that from the other side of the desk.
Mhm. Well, in my own case, I grew up in a family in which not only did nobody go to college, nobody even graduated from high school. And so I saw people like my father and my grandfather working all day for almost nothing. And I knew I didn't want that life. I loved books. I wanted to write them. And what I lived in constant fear of was waking up one day and being about 55 years old and looking at myself in the mirror and knowing that there was something I wanted and I didn't give every ounce of effort to try to get it for myself. And it was partly prompted by the fear of, having that day and, trying so hard to avoid it.
Those are really beautiful parting thoughts. And this was such a rich conversation. Just thank you so much for coming and giving so much of yourselves. So we're very grateful.
Thank you, Suzanne.
Thank you, Suzanne. It's been a pleasure talking with you, and I'm grateful for the conversation.
Yeah, it's lovely. Thanks, you guys. I hope you're able to tune into some more of the festival, but yeah, either way, it's been amazing to have you on.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for coming. Thanks out there too.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you for